Hi, I received a comment on one of my other videos recently asking my thoughts on using legumes as a nitrogen source. And I'm going to approach that as if the question was using a legume cover crop as a nitrogen source. So I said I would take care of answering those questions in a video within the next couple of days at that time. And I attempted to do that, and everything that I was able to get on film and on audio felt like a bunch of babbling to me, so I thought I'd let it set for a little bit, and I'm going to try to rectify that today. The first thing that I want to talk about is for any of you who might be watching this who are not farmers or not horticulturalists or don't know what a legume is. A legume is a certain kind of plant that, as farmers are concerned, is known to fix nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, into the soil. An example of what a legume would be, to your common knowledge, green beans would be a legume. Peas that you would grow in your garden would be a legume. Most clovers are legumes. There are trees that are legumes. There are a lot of different kinds of legume plants. And as I said, the reason that farmers get interested in them and horticulturalists is often their ability to fix nitrogen into the soil. The first thing that I want to address about a legume plant is that it isn't actually the plant that fixes the nitrogen into the soil. All plants take in some atmospheric nitrogen because it's there. They breathe in the atmosphere, and both through the roots and through the plant themselves. It's not actually the legume plant that fixes the nitrogen into a plant available form in the soil. There are bacteria, certain strains of bacteria called rhizobiums, that colonize the roots of legume plants. And there are different strains of those bacteria for different types of legume plants. For instance, peanuts are a legume, and there's one strain of bacteria that colonizes those roots. But while soybeans that we typically grow on the farm are a legume, it's a completely different strain of bacteria that will colonize those roots. And what farmers typically do when they plant those legume species is we put an inoculant on the seed when we plant it, which is really just impregnating that seed with that bacteria so that as the plant starts to grow, the bacteria colony will grow and start the nitrogen fixation process. And the way that works is it's a symbiotic relationship between the plant and that bacteria. There are carbohydrate compounds, sugar compounds that bacteria wants, that is its food, that the plant can provide, and the plant wants the nitrogen that the bacteria can provide. So over the eons, this symbiotic relationship has evolved between these plants and that bacteria, where the plant says, hey, I'll give you this sugar if you give me some nitrogen, and the bacteria says, yeah, I'll give you some nitrogen as long as you give me the sugar. And that's what happens. And what you'll see on the roots of those plants, if you dig them up, are something that we call nodules. They're like they look like little tumors on the roots of those plants, and those are the actual nitrogen nodules where that bacteria is in there doing its thing. Now, why is that important to a farmer? All of our plants that we grow for cash crops, all of the plants that you grow, use some level of nitrogen. Some use a lot more than others. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about soybeans because that's one of the cash crops that we grow here on this farm. Soybeans are capable of producing more nitrogen than they themselves need. So you have this excess nitrogen left there in the root system. And we like to credit that nitrogen to the soil for, in most cases on this farm, I plant wheat following the soybeans, although not always, but we like to see that wheat crop, which is not able to host a rhizobium and fix its own nitrogen, we like to see that nitrogen credited to the next wheat crop so I can cut back on my fertilizer bill a little bit. And that's why farmers get interested in legume plants, is their ability to collect nitrogen into the soil. Now, I want to bring that around to a cover crop conversation, because that's the way I took the question and that's the way I look at the question. Is a legume cover crop a good way to provide nitrogen for your subsequent cash crops? Now, before I delve into answering that question, I'm going to again state my standard disclaimer that I am not a credentialed agronomist or soil scientist. I am not a certified crop advisor. I'm a farmer. I also happen to believe in cover crops and sell cover crop seeds, but I'm answering this from the standpoint of what I have learned from the research and studying that I have done and the things that I have seen going on in my fields, and that's the way I'm answering this question. So don't go thinking that I'm speaking as some kind of a world's authority on this. This is just largely my opinion and my observation. But whether or not a legume as a nitrogen source for a following cover crop is a good idea is yes, but it depends. And here's what it depends on. Some legumes are able to fix a lot more nitrogen than others. Soybeans can fix quite a bit of nitrogen, but they use quite a bit of nitrogen too. And as soon as that legume plant reaches maturity and dies, it stops producing the root exudates that bacteria wants, so that bacteria starts to die as well. So you have a limited time window in there for that nitrogen to be taken up by another plant. The nitrogen that is produced by a legume crop is just as susceptible to leaching or volatilization as any other nitrogen source is. In fact, maybe more so, because that nitrogen is already in the nitrate form that is plant available, readily plant available. And while it's the most readily plant available, it is also the most subject to leaching and volatilization. That's the stuff that gases off into the atmosphere or winds up in the rivers and streams and causes these algae blooms that we don't want to have. And that's where you're at. So if you don't have a plant there ready to take up that nitrogen, you immediately start to lose it. Now, soybeans are a decent nitrogen producer. Things like alfalfa, hay are very good nitrogen producers. Hairy vetch is one that I have used here that I've had good results with. Sun hemp, there are a lot of different legume plants that you can plant that will host a bacteria that fixes nitrogen for you, but whether or not it's a good nitrogen source for a subsequent cash crop is an it depends kind of situation. Typically, when I plant legumes in my cover crops, it's in a mix. And that typically happens following either soybeans. If I have soybean acres that aren't going directly into wheat, I'll plant a cover crop behind them, and I'll include a legume in that. And also, after my wheat, I will plant an aggressive mix of cover crops. For the last 2 years, I've used a 10 species mix, and in that 10 species mix, there are 3 or 4 legumes that are in there. But one component of those mixes that I will plant that way is always, in fact, half of it is usually a grass component, because the grasses will quickly take up that nitrogen that is produced by the legume plants, and it will soak up the excess nitrogen that may be in the soil that might be left over from the cash crop that was there before it. So the nitrogen that I bought up at the chemical plant, or the nutrients that I bought up at the chemical plant to put on my field to grow my cash crop, there is probably some of that left, and I don't want to let it just wash out the bottom or gas out the top. So I put a cover crop out there to soak it up. And that's the whole idea of the cover crop. I like my grass components of my cover crops. I like some portion of them to be something that will overwinter, so that it, like cereal rye I use quite a bit, annual ryegrass I use quite a bit. Rapeseed may or may not overwinter in this climate. A lot of times it does, sometimes it doesn't. Some of the legumes will overwinter if you get them planted at just the right time. But my major goal with planting a cover crop is not to provide a nitrogen source. Now, I do put legumes in there, but I do that more to feed the non-legume components of the cover crop mixes, so that the cover crop can take that up and store it. And then the next year when I plant my corn or whatever into that field, as that cover crop decays, it will release those nutrients and the corn can take it up then. But even then, my main goal with the cover crops is not to produce nitrogen fertilizer for the cash crop. I'm trying to build soil structure and soil health. I'm trying to promote the biological activity in the soil, and by that I mean the bacteria, the nematodes. And we talk about nematodes on soybeans all the time. We like to talk about soybean cyst nematode, and somehow the nematodes have gotten the reputation of they're all bad. Well, there's only 2 or 3 of them that are bad. There are hundreds of them that are actually beneficial for you. But that's a whole nother subject that I'm not going to get into right now. My goal with the cover crops is to promote an active, diverse soil biology and the structure of the soil and the tilth of the soil. And I want to add organic matter to the soil. In other words, carbon. I want my active soil carbon to come up. That's what I grow cover crops for. Now, legumes, as a general rule, don't have a very extensive root system, and therefore they don't do very much for the soil structure and the soil biology. When I worked as an engineer, we had something called the 80-20 rule. And how the 80-20 rule, and it applies to other industries, not just engineering, but what the 80-20 rule says is that 80% of the strength is in 20% of the material, or 80% of the result comes from 20% of the effort. So what you want to pay attention to is that 20% that is producing the 80%. Well, 80% of the result of a cover crop comes from the roots, not from the vegetative growth above the ground. 80% of it comes from the roots. Now, that doesn't mean that you should ignore the vegetative growth above the ground, and I'm going to talk about something there in that vein in a minute. But you want to pay attention to the thing that gets you the most bang for your buck, and it's the roots that get you the most bang for your buck on the cover crops. So most legumes don't have a very extensive root system. Also, the vegetative growth on most legumes doesn't have a lot of lignous material in it, which means it's a succulent type vegetative growth. It doesn't last very long. It decays quickly. So it doesn't really provide you a lot of cover, which is what the food for your earthworms and things is. And those are the things that are really going to get your soil going and perking and feed that soil biology. So legumes by themselves as a cover crop, I really don't think it's a good idea to plant a pure stand of a legume and say that's going to be my nitrogen source and that's going to improve my soil, because I really don't think it will. There are a couple of notable exceptions to that. One of them that I've planted for the last 2 years that I'm really kind of excited to see where I can go with it is sun hemp. I planted sun hemp as part of my 10-way mix behind my wheat. The first year I did that, it made a modest showing, but it did put on some roots with some nitrogen nodules. This year, after my wheat in July, I planted a similar mix with quite a bit of sun hemp in it, and I've been really pleased with the way that turned out. The root system was not as extensive as some of the grasses are, but it had a root system on it. It nodulated very heavily, which meant it was making a significant nitrogen contribution, and it put on a lot of vegetative growth. And because it's a relative of the hemp plants, it's not a true hemp, but it's a relative of the hemp plants, It has a long, thin stalk that does have some lignous material in it, which means it's going to provide some plant residue, some biomass on top of the soil that's going to last for a little while. Now, of course, also in that mix, there was some Austrian winter peas, and I'm thinking of giving those up because I have yet to have an Austrian winter pea that survived the winter. I just haven't seen any survival rate of any kind on this farm from the Austrian winter pea, so I'm kind of ready to give up on those. I plant some Berseem clover, sometimes some medium red clover or some crimson clover. It depends on what the preceding crop was and what kind of manure treatment I might have used. Now, you guys that are getting into cover crops and you have a supply of hog manure and you're pumping liquid hog manure, I'll tell you something that I learned the hard way. Crimson clover and liquid hog manure do not get along. If you're pumping liquid hog manure out on your ground and you're planting a mix that has crimson clover in it, the crimson clover isn't going to come around if you've got liquid hog manure out there. That's an experience thing. It's not a scientifically backed thing, but I've seen it. I have other people that have done the same thing that have seen it. If you're pumping liquid hog manure, forget the crimson clover. It's not going to do you any good. Back to how this all plays in with the cover crops, I think if you're planting a cover crop mix and heavy on the grasses, definitely mix a legume into it. Those grasses will take up the excess nitrogen when that legume is done with it, or the excess that they produce. I think that's a great idea. The biomass of those plants that took up that nitrogen will hold it there until they decay, and then you'll have that nitrogen available to your following cash crop, be it corn or wheat or whatever. That's the goal right there. So, just saying that, well, I planted this cover crop of crimson clover or cowpeas or whatever it was, and it's going to produce all that nitrogen. It winter kills in November. By the time you plant your corn in April, most of that nitrogen is going to be gone. It's going to have leached out the bottom or volatilized out the top. So you're going to get maybe 10 or 20% of that nitrogen. And the nitrogen that comes from those cover crops is just as damaging to our water systems, our streams and our rivers and oceans and lakes and things. That nitrogen is just as damaging as the nitrogen we get up at the chemical plant. It's not just chemical nitrogen that causes those environmental impacts. It's excess nitrogen. Now, one other caveat that I want to put on this before I sign off is that I often talk about chemical fertilizers, and a negative connotation could be taken from that. Now, I want you to understand that I am not opposed to chemical fertilizers. I am opposed to too much chemical fertilizer. There's a couple of facts that I have heard along the way, and you can go verify these if you like or not, but only about, on average, 40% of the chemical fertilizers that we put on the field actually make it to the plants that we plant. That means 60% of the fertilizer that we buy is going to waste. It's washing out the bottom and causing these algae blooms in Lake Erie and Grand Lake St. Mary's, which is kind of personal to me. And it's flushing down the Mississippi River and causing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the phosphorus and the nitrogen especially. The phosphorus is maybe the bigger one, but the nitrogen is maybe just as big. It's the excess that causes that problem, not that the fact that it's the nitrogen source is not the cause of that problem. It's that there's too much of it that causes that problem. So I'm not anti-chemical fertilizer. I'm anti-too much fertilizer. And you can produce too much nitrogen with a legume just as well as you can do it with a chemical nitrogen source. And that's where I'm going to stop that. That's where I'm going to end this video. If you have questions or comments about it, please feel free to leave them below. If there's something that I didn't address that you want to know, I'll get around to it. I can't say I'll be quick about it, but I will. Those are my thoughts. Thanks for watching. Have a good evening.